Tuia ki te rangi, tuia ki te whenua, tuia ki te ngāko o ngā tangata, ko te mea nui, ko te aroha, tihei, Māori ora. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. No Airangi, no Ingarangi, no Iharaira o Hutipuna. Mai rāno i te timatanga i tira rautau, i noho tōku whānau, kei rongi te whenua o Kaitahu, kei Otiputi, kei Waimati, kei Te Tihi o Maru, kei Ototahi, hei tangata tiriti. Ko Gaynor Page, rau ko Kelly Dorgan, Opi Matua, ko Hamish Allen, Taku ho Rangatira, ko Flynn, rau ko Martha, Aki Tamariki. Ko Kelly Dorgan, tōku ingoa, he kai whakawhānau pēpia hau, ingari kei te mahi a hau inainei, hei kai whakapiki te haora whāngai u kei te kōwaitanga, Kyoto Tahi Trust.
Tēnā koe.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So yes, I'm Kelly Dorgan. My people came to Aotearoa, New Zealand from Ireland, a couple from England and one, my maternal great-grandmother from Israel via a few other places, and made their home on the land of Kaitahu as the people of the treaty in Dunedin, Waimati, Timaru and Christchurch. And I'm a midwife working for a Māori health and social services provider as a breastfeeding health promoter. And I was recently asked if I would present on Māori breastfeeding, and I was clear that being Pākehā, what's happening for Māori in the world of breastfeeding isn't my story to tell. However, I was also aware that I had a growing pile of literature on my desk relating to how non-Māori systems, practices and people impact on Māori health outcomes. And I was really keen to have an excuse to commit to getting through that pile of literature, and so I offered to talk about that in relation to breastfeeding. And I was thinking it would be a pretty straightforward presentation looking at history of Māori breastfeeding, pre-colonisation, post-colonisation, and then looking at what's happening now, having a look at some of the cognitive shortcuts that we use, and then maybe seeking some strategies to look at how we might best support tangata whenua with their breastfeeding in the future. And so I began with the history. But very quickly I realised that the history that I had ready access to as a Pākehā was largely a post-colonial written history, one that was written by white males, which is a kind of interesting perspective, but one that wasn't really relevant to what I was looking for. So then I saw the breastfeeding history written only by Māori in academia. And interestingly, it seemed that most of those were referencing the same white males that I'd come across. And I realised that these theses were written as part of a pretty patriarchal colonial education system that valued certain ways of knowing over others. And it all got a bit annoying, really. And when I explored my frustration, I realised that race was getting in my way, like my race was getting in my way, and that was a novel experience, because usually my race stays well clear of my way, and if I'm honest, it probably rather invisibly paves my way. And I realised as I started working through my reading pile that making an honest attempt at doing Māori health and breastfeeding justice as a non-Māori was probably going to get a bit uncomfortable, both for me and for my audience, and I had to give myself a bit of a pep talk. Come on, I said, you're a midwife. You've made a career out of working with people, supporting them through their discomfort, and encouraging women to trust that they'll find immense strength in surrendering to that discomfort. So just approach it like a mini labour, much like you do a power yoga class or a run around the block or something. And so I considered my audience as well and thought, what audience would be more compassionate and humble than one that works with Māori in support of breastfeeding? So I decided I was up for the challenge, and what I'm presenting to you today is an account of my Pākehā journey of trying to stay open and curious as I committed to considering the literature that relates to the impact of race on healthcare and its relationship to breastfeeding. And thus, in true white fashion, I'd managed to make it all about me. So thanks for inviting me very much. I'm sorry that I wasn't here to hear the introductions and to hear where you all come from. And I also apologise to those of you who've heard this talk before. I've been told that some have got their hankies ready, and that was never my intention. I did make myself cry last time as well, which was completely unintentional as well, so apologies in advance in case that happens. So back to the history of breastfeeding, because it was still pretty relevant, and from the information that I had access to, it seemed to me to be well accepted that pre-colonisation all babies were breastfed, often by their biological mothers, but also often from another woman, another mother in the hapu. And this seemed to be in keeping with reports that children were seen as the collective responsibility of the hapu and the iwi, that babies and children were highly valued as the continuation of the whakapapa and as a future of the hapu or the iwi. Pregnant, labouring and postpartum women were considered tapu or sacred. The uterus was known as the whare tangata, or the house of the people. The placenta or whenua was considered to be an important connection as it supported this continuation of whakapapa, and as such was honoured as the nurturer of the people. Interpersonal relationships were highly valued, and the core Māori values of te aroha, love and compassion, te kōtahitanga, unity, te whanaungatanga, relationships, show how important these connections were. So the Māori word for spirit is wairoa, which loosely translates as two waters. The first of these two waters referring to the tears of Ranginui, or Sky Father, in the form of rain, and the second is the breast milk of Papa Tuanuku, Earth Mother, in the form of lakes, rivers and streams, and these waters figuratively connect everything in the world. And the literal meaning of ukai pō is to be fed by the breast at night, which refers to the spiritual, emotional and physical nourishment that's given through the comfort and intimate relationship between mother and child. It's also symbolic of people returning to their place of birth, or their tūranga waiwai, to be recharged and nurtured. And I like to think that mothers and grandmothers also function as ukai pō long after the breastfeeding relationship, and that they're the place that we all return to, even into adulthood, if we need spiritual, emotional and physical nourishment. And so it therefore seemed, through my Pākehā lens, that Māoridom a culture of connection of the people to the land, to the spiritual world, to the natural world, to their ancestors, and to each other, including their children. And it also seems that the things that facilitate these connections are highly valued, and thus breastfeeding as the nurturer of future leaders, and breast milk as yet another connector of the layers of whakapapa would also be considered a taonga or a treasure. And I could have stayed in this phase of exploration and information gathering for a lot longer. However, at some stage I had to bring myself to face colonisation. And at this stage, the excitement of my pseudo pregnancy was overridden by a sense of dread at what was to come. So here's where my pseudo labour pains started. So in 1769 arrived the British, and along with them muskets and measles, syphilis and strawberries, patriarchy and possums, and at some stage breast milk substitutes. And when it all became a bit much, there was a treaty and a tiriti, the version that was signed by Māori. A tiriti that, in spite of some discrepancy between languages, promised Māori protection of the things they valued, including health, and access to everything offered to the citizens of the Commonwealth. And here's where I had to start my deep breathing, because I found myself wanting to move through this literature pretty quick smart, and having a time limit for this presentation offered a few breaths of the internots that I was seeking. So it appeared to me that colonisation is an inherently disconnecting mindset. And I wonder how a population that valued connection so little as to want to leave behind their land of origin, their people of origin, and all the other connections within those societies to settle on the other side of the world could possibly comprehend the relationships that this culture of connection had with the things that they valued. And was this mindset the reason that Te Tiriti was largely ignored? Whatever the mechanism, it seems that colonisation had a result of gross disconnection. And this kind of disconnection from the many sources of well-being a society or a people have is documented in literature about Indigenous, historic, intergenerational colonial trauma. Now, I'd come to the trauma literature a little bit sideways after my 19-year-old son had an accident while he was working in Australia just over a year ago and suffered, among other injuries, a severe traumatic brain injury. We spent a month with him in hospital before we were able to bring him home. And for over 2 weeks of that time, between ICU and starting rehab, he was in a low stimulus environment, which was a bit like a prison cell with a hospital bed, so that he could allow his brain to reorganise itself. And he slept a lot, which gave me a lot of time to read. And so I read a lot on traumatic brain injury, and it was all pretty disheartening. And there were times when I thought that I actually couldn't carry on. This was my baby, who I'd breastfed for 3.5 years, for whom I'd interrupted my career for 6 years so that I could be home with him when he was little. My baby had grown into a gentle, capable and talented young man, and who was then facing the absolute unknown as he had to try to learn to walk and feed himself, to relate to people and completely re-navigate his new body, his new brain and his new world. And I found it completely heartbreaking. And I knew that the stress of the situation was affecting me both significantly, both emotionally and physically. And so I decided to have a break from the brain trauma literature and to turn to something a little bit lighter. So I started reading up on chronic stress and psychological trauma in the hope that I might find some strategies to strengthen me so that I could best support him. And what I was reminded of was a stress response whereby the brainstem is activated in order to prepare for what the brain perceives as a threat to its existence, and how this activity can override the cortex that's responsible for decision making and for inhibitory responses, and how over time, if the organism remains in a state of stress, there are a number of potentially significant outcomes. So first, this barrage of stress hormones is a rather unhealthy cocktail for the body to be constantly bathed in. And thus the risk of illness and disease increases. And second, the diminished access to the frontal cortex can result in impulsiveness and poor decision making. Thus this imbalance or dysregulation can result in the loss of the ability to relax and to trust, as well as a reduction in the ability to manage impulses. Unchecked and unmanaged, it's likely to result in an increased risk of overreaction, violence, impulsivity, addiction, crime, and of many illnesses, but also in an increased risk of further trauma, both physical and psychological. So this information was ample incentive for me to put in place a routine of nutritional supplementation, meditation, physical exercise, and emotional support. And with these things in place, I found I was able to look beyond what was happening with our family and to start noticing some other things going on around us. And being in the Northern Territory of Australia and pretty much living at the hospital, I noticed a significant number of Aboriginal patients and families on the wards and the grounds. And I found myself looking at the Indigenous population differently in light of my newfound knowledge of the impact of trauma. Seeing this population through a trauma lens had me considering colonisation as an experience of significant collective trauma, and asking what this might mean for a whole people experiencing incredibly stressful events over a long period of time. After returning to New Zealand, I came across a whole new body of literature that was somewhat alarming. And I was really surprised that I'd never come across this concept in almost 20 years that I'd spent in the health system here. And I dug further into the literature and eventually came across this information from the recent Justice Forum that kind of seemed to pull it all together. And I thought, is this a justice issue? Because to me it appears to be a health issue, and a mental health issue, and a social development issue, but above all, a colonisation issue. And it also struck me that it is in fact what I grew up believing to be Māoridom. I was now realising that what I'd thought of as Māori culture was in fact the result of colonisation. And of course, I knew that as a non-Māori living in New Zealand that I had a responsibility to Te Tiriti, but this was kind of next level stuff, and it's really left me thinking differently. So maybe Māori still honour those traditional values of connection, and perhaps people just like me and mine have kept getting in the way of those health-giving connections. So by now my labour was establishing and starting to get pretty jolly uncomfortable, because I think of myself as being a compassionate, progressive sort of person, and that made this place a hard place to sit. So there was cognitive dissonance at play, and that it's difficult to marry the notions of me being compassionate and yet having a role in these terrible outcomes. There certainly was temptation to be defensive, to argue myself out of this space and to deny my contribution, because it's not pleasant to acknowledge that me and mine have had a part to play. And yet when I look at what is different for Māori and their experience of our health system and our society in general, it's pretty hard not to accept it. And I'm aware that we all have cognitive tricks that we subconsciously employ to maintain our self-worth, our sanity, and our sense of ourselves as decent people. Tricks such as defensiveness and denial. But what happens if we can find the humility to stay aware of our responses to the suggestion that if we're not Māori, we may have a responsibility for these outcomes? Because my sense is that if we surrender to the discomfort, we might just be taken through the dissonance to a space of understanding that in fact, if we don't surrender to it, if we don't acknowledge the impact of our race, if we continue to engage our self-protecting mental shortcuts, then in fact we're being less compassionate. And I thought that maybe having a look or having a reminder about some cognitive tricks might help us understand. But yeah, so that's a link. That should just play.
Psychologists have known for some time that we have two operating systems for processing information within the brain, working at the same time but doing very different things with the same information. The conscious and the unconscious. The conscious is part of our new brain, developed fairly recently. This is where most of the clever thinking goes on, problem solving, decision making. It is slow in operation, taking several seconds to process even basic information and to make decisions. It is very limited in processing power, just 8 bits of information at any one time, and it is driven by taught rules about how to do things and how to think. It relies on logically processing data. We believe that it is in control because in our lives we see all of the achievements of the conscious: technology, civil society, agriculture. The list goes on. The unconscious, on the other hand, is rarely seen working. It runs constantly and effortlessly in the background, handling all of our routine information processing, a sort of autopilot. Instead of being slow and data-driven, it is incredibly fact and intuitively driven. It is a processing method, needed by our ancestors to make rapid survival decisions. Brain scan evidence shows it processes information in people in as little as 30 milliseconds, 10 times faster than our eyes can even process the person's face. It has much more processing power than the conscious, 200,000 times more. Psychologists say that what the brain fires together, it wires together. In other words, when it often sees two things occurring together, like women with children or women receptionists, it creates a strong neural connection in the brain, which it can use in the future. For example, when it sees women, it thinks children. And when it thinks children, it makes the connection to women. This is very convenient for the brain. It prevents it having to use the conscious to think about every new person or situation as unique. The brain makes these neural connections from the patterns we see in our lives, but also from the media we absorb and what the people we care about say, as well as our upbringing. Once wired, they are hard to unwire, and we can use them automatically and without knowing it. It is our caveman or cavewoman brain. Let me put things into perspective. If the processing power of the conscious was the size of a table tennis ball, the processing power of the unconscious is a table tennis ball 200,000 times larger, or 2.4 meters across. When the small conscious table tennis ball is busy or overwhelmed, which it often is, the unconscious takes over routine people decisions using its neural pathways based on previous patterns. The next bit is important. Our unconscious creates super fast connections between groups of people: old, young, black, white, with tattoos, wearing funny t-shirts, having a particular accent, from a particular area or country, educated at a particular school or university, and good or bad ideas the psychologists call constructs. These super fast links are used to make rapid people judgments below the level of our subconscious. The conscious thinks it is in control, but the unconscious calls the shots and leaves the conscious to believe it is in control by rationalizing decisions the unconscious has already made. These super fast people decisions are useful in making our lives run smoothly. Most of the time they are good enough, and our ancestors avoided the saber-toothed tiger or lion. But these days, our people decisions result in real impacts on the lives of real people. Who gets the job? Who gets the most rewarding work? Who gets the best pay or bonus? And who gets promoted or fired? We tend to wire more positive connections for people who are like us, who look like us, sound like us, share our background, culture, and interests. That leaves people who are less like us not being treated as positively. Don't get me wrong, often these more positive wirings for people who are like us does not lead to obvious negative behavior towards people not like us, but they experience what the psychologists call micro-behaviors, small bits of behavior which, over time, make them feel less like they belong or are valued, like acid rain that wears you down over time. It leads to us recruiting and supporting people who are more like us. We don't do it on purpose. We don't have a tick list reminding us to give slightly better treatment to people like us, but our unconscious leads us to do that unless we are careful. The bottom line is that we trust people for whom we have unintentionally wired positive connections. We give them jobs, give them the best work, allocate them to our teams, and say the right things about them when it matters. This doesn't make us a bad person. It makes us human. But when we make important decisions about people, we need to take extra care. If you are now asking, what can I do about it? You should watch our animated session where we offer some ideas, sometimes slightly weird ideas, on mitigating unconscious bias, or watch our whiteboard animation on recruiting.
And in healthcare, implicit bias occurs when a healthcare provider automatically, that is subconsciously, classifies a patient as a member of a group and applies pre-programmed stereotypical characteristics of a group, whether positive or negative, to the individual. And there are a number of studies showing evidence of Māori receiving poorer healthcare in spite of Te Tiriti. It's some of these sobering findings. And it's also known that there are large health disparities between Māori and non-Māori. There are a number of initiatives in place to try and address these inequities with variable impact, in a sense that we're not able to claim to be honouring Te Tiriti until those health outcomes are in line with or better than those of non-Māori. And if we flip the narrative and make the Māori experience of the health system the normative experience, how might this look? And is this okay? So with my son, it looked like this. This is my son who had never had antibiotics or paracetamol prior. Ended up on quite a cocktail. So a white male patient, thus less chance of being disadvantaged by healthcare bias. And as his parents, being white means that we're more likely to be educated. Being white and educated means we're more likely to be healthy and that we're more likely to have the financial means to be with him for a month as he became well enough to come home. Our education, in this case 3 health degrees, including a physiotherapy one, meant that we're more easily able to navigate the health system to his advantage, to provide optimal nutrition, to understand the implications of his condition, and how to best support his treatment. And these advantages meant that we were able to be there for him to connect to and feel protected and supported by as his ukai pō, as he navigated an incredibly scary journey from coma to rehab and beyond. And he's made a remarkable recovery. He's working full-time as a chef in a busy Christchurch restaurant, he's got tickets to head to Europe next year. And while we can't prove that this is due to white privilege, it certainly seems that a number of the advantages that are more readily available to colonisers rather than the colonised significantly increase the odds of a better outcome. And where's the justice in this? And what does it mean for breastfeeding, which of course is kind of our role here. Well, as you know, breastfeeding is considered an important health determinant, and I had a whole lot of things in there, but you guys all know all the benefits. So I've left that bit out. And rates of breastfeeding for non-Māori have been higher than those for Māori for many years, in spite of it being considered tikanga, or the right thing in Māori culture, and in spite of theoretic protection from te tiriti. So is a combination of colonisation and its ongoing impacts, including practitioner bias, responsible for this inequity? Intersectionality, or a crossroad of disadvantages, means that it's difficult to extrapolate which disadvantages have the biggest impact on breastfeeding. It's a big mashup of chicken and egg situations, given that all women are disadvantaged within patriarchal systems, that Māori women are more likely to be part of the most deprived populations, to experience violence, to have preterm babies, to have mental health concerns, to have diabetes, to have housing issues, to have involvement with child protection services, to be socially isolated, etc. And these are things that have been implicated in shorter breastfeeding journeys for all women. The evidence from around the world is clear that it's these kinds of outcomes that are a direct result of colonisation. So as we all know in this room, breastfeeding can be challenging. And while many Māori show incredible resilience, there's a limit to how many challenges one can face before being in a situation or having to make a decision that won't be in the best long-term health interests of an individual, the whānau, the hapu, the whakapapa, often due to other priorities. And Māori are addressing these things, and since I started working on this presentation, the Waitangi Tribunal case pertaining to health has begun. But for those of us who are not Māori, can we stand by? So maybe it's time for us to flip the narrative. And rather than looking at how Māori culture is getting in the way of better health and breastfeeding outcomes, is it time for for us to consider instead, in light of the available information, that maybe these outcomes are largely due to non-Māori systems, practices and people getting in the way. So as health practitioners, we all have an obligation to acknowledge race in our work. So how do we do this? Well, I think most of us take advantage of the fact that as Pākehā living in a society that allows us to ignore the significance of our racial impact, to get through every day without having to consider it, a society that considers whiteness as neutral. The way we acknowledge race in our lives and our work is solely in terms of other races, in terms of others' races. We've been able to live and work blind to impact historical and current of our own race. So staying open through this exploration without employing my usual cognitive bypasses was actually really exhausting, like a real labour. And also like a real labour, the so-called reward is a pretty huge responsibility that will last for the rest of my life. But like the responsibility of parenthood, I'd hope that this responsibility offers many potential benefits. So the benefit of understanding that Māoridom is a culture of love and connection, that is a beautiful thing to explore. The benefit of understanding that by being curious about my cognitive responses, I can better understand my tendencies towards bias. And the benefit of knowing that there's great value in learning to be comfortable in my own discomfort. So the title of this presentation comes from a Māori proverb, a whakatauki. E kore te pātiki, e hoki ki tōna puihu. The flounder does not return to its unsettled dust. And to me, this is suggesting that we don't keep making the same mistakes, that we find a way to move on. Colonisation has literally and figuratively muddied every waterway, giving us nowhere to return that isn't affected by it. And these waters have become so muddy that many of us have closed our eyes to them. So through this process of midwifing myself, through the discomfort of exploring the literature about how my race relates to Māori health and the potential impacts of this on breastfeeding, I feel like I've been able to open my eyes just a little bit, to stop blindly expecting the answers to come through the ideas of cultural safety, cultural competency, cultural responsiveness, cultural compassion, which are all really great things, but are all terms that perpetuate the invisibility of our white culture by not naming it. And I think that that's the challenge, or the whittle, is to keep our eyes open, to surrender to discomfort in order to really see our role, to be aware of our racial impact, to talk about it, to read about it, to acknowledge it. White privilege, white defensiveness, white fragility, implicit bias and racism, and to finally start settling that unsettled dust by truly seeking effective pathways to health equity and breastfeeding equity for Māori, who, by the way, don't need our help. They just need us to stop being the barrier. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.